So now that we do have these meal items here, it's time to make sure that we can also go to a meal detail page so that we can tap such a meal and be taken there. And this is a great practice for you because it's essentially a similar process to what we did to get from categories to this list of meals. I want you to add the code to this project that allows users to tap those meal items and gets them to a meal detail screen. Of course, you have yet to add this meal detail screen, and for the moment it doesn't have to be too fancy. Just make sure that you output the meal title in the app bar, and then below that the meal image, and we'll then work on the rest of this details screen together thereafter. But first, give it a try on your own. So, did you succeed? Let's build this together, and let's make sure that users can tap those meal items to be taken to the meal details screen. Now for this, as mentioned, we first of all have to add such a meal details screen, which is what I'm doing here, adding a new file in that screens folder called meal details. And then in there, we have the meal details class. And just as before, here we can extend stateless widget like this, because indeed here we won't need to manage any state. And we need our build method, and then of course also our constructor, meal details like this, where we get and forward the key. And for the moment, this will be a stateless widget. Later, we'll turn this into a stateful widget, but for the moment, we just need a stateless widget. Now here, we'll also need to store some data. We'll need to get some data to output those meal details. And to be precise, we of course need the meal. So the meal, which should be of type meal, and for that, of course, you must import the meal model file. Then, of course, we also have to make sure that we get this meal parameter and store the value received on that parameter in this meal property. Now that we got that meal, we can return our scaffold here because we have a brand new screen, as mentioned. And in this scaffold, I want to have an app bar using Flutter's app bar widget, where the title is set to a text widget where I output the title of the meal that was selected, so of this meal here. Now besides the app bar, we of course also have a body in that scaffold, and for the moment, as mentioned, it's enough if we simply output the image of that meal here. For that, we can use Flutter's image widget, and as you learned earlier in the course, this widget has various constructor functions that allow us to load images from different sources. And here I need image network since, as mentioned earlier, our images are in the end URLs to images that are stored somewhere in the internet. And image network loads these images from those places and then displays them in this app. So here we got image network. And then I can access meal.image URL here to set the URL for this image. Now, in addition, I want to assign a width of double infinity to make sure that we take all the available space. And I'll give this a height of, let's say, 300, and then add fit box fit cover to make sure that the image is sized appropriately, but not distorted. And with that, we're outputting this image here. The rest will follow later. But with that, we got the meal details screen, as it should actually be called, since we'll use this widget as a screen. So to be consistent with my other widget names, this should be meal details screen. And with that added here, we can go back to the meal start file, where we have the meals screen, which displays all the meals. And there we want to make sure that if a single meal item here is tapped, we go to the meal details screen. Now for that, of course, inside of that meal item widget, we have our inkwell, which allows us to register a function for the tap event. So whenever a user taps on this item. Now here in the end, in this meal item widget, I don't wanna handle the tap, but instead I just wanna get a function as an additional property, so a function here, which gets the meal on which I tapped as an input, and which will be stored in a property called onSelectMeal, for example. And of course, we then must make sure that this property is set when the class is instantiated, like this. And it's then onSelectMeal that should be connected to the inkwell, so that's set as a value for the onTap parameter. This, however, doesn't work because onTap does not provide such a meal, and onSelectMeal is a function that wants to get a meal, and therefore here I'll set onTap equal to an anonymous function, and in there we can manually execute onSelectMeal and then pass our meal as a value to onSelectMeal. And this meal which I am passing as a value here is this meal property. With that, in the meals.dart file, where I'm outputting these meal items, I now have to set this onSelectMeal parameter, which we just added to the meal item widget. So therefore here in meals.dart, I want to add a new function, which could be named selectMeal. And this should get the selected meal as an input. And that's in line with the parameter we just added in meal item, because that wants a function that gets a meal as an input. And we're now creating such a function in the meal.start file. This function here, it takes a meal as an input. And in there, I then again want to use the navigator built into Flutter of context. And therefore we'll have to make sure that I actually also get my build context here, like this. And then we can again call push here to push a new screen onto our stack of screens. And this new screen here is the MealDetails screen, though, as you learned, not passed into push like this, but instead wrapped in such a material page route, which has this builder where we get the context and where we then return our MealDetails screen like this. And now it's select meal, which I in the end want to use down here as a value for onSelectMeal, though it is worth noting that selectMeal now of course is a function that does not just get a meal, but also a context. So now we could either edit meal item dart and make sure that here we also accept a context in our type definition. And then we would need to pass a context down here when we call onSelectMeal. Or alternatively, in meal.start, we don't set selectMeal as a value for onSelectMeal, but instead we set another function as a value here, which gets a meal, because inside of meal item, where we are calling this function in the end, we do pass such a meal. But then here we manually call selectMeal, and we kind of forward that meal that we're getting here, but we're also passing the context to selectMeal, and the context here is available since we're inside of the build method, where we do have this context. And that's how I will do it here. So we call selectMeal here in this place inside of meals.dart, forwarding that meal, which we get from inside meal item. And then in selectMeal, we're pushing our MealDetails screen as a route onto our stack of screens. Well, and that should be all that needs to be done. If we now save this and force a reload, we should be able to select a category and then a meal. And as you can see, I'm taken to that newly added MealDetails screen. And of course, we still automatically get this back button, which we can then use to go back and pop screens off that stack of screens. But that's how this forward-backward navigation works in the end, simply by using navigator push. And if we ever would want to pop a screen off manually, for example because some button was clicked, we could of course always do that by using navigator of context pop. Or alternatively, as we did it before, navigator pop and passing the context to it. We don't need to do this here, but that is how you could manually go back to the previous screen.